Welcome to our Back to Basics presentation. This is how the IEP helps to promote progress for students with disabilities. My name's Stephen Prater. We are going to have Amy Peterson and Riley O'Donnell also as our presenters, and I'll let them introduce themselves here in a few minutes. And while we are going to be introducing ourselves, we want all of you to introduce yourselves just real quick. So in the chat, if you don't mind sharing your name, sharing your role, and sharing where you come from, put that in the chat. And while everybody's kind of doing that, I will introduce myself very quick, and then I'll pass it to Amy and pass it to Riley so they can introduce themselves as well. But I'm Stephen Prater, and I am the lead of our intensive technical assistance team here at the Progress Center, and we were the team that would work directly with those partnership sites that Tessie referenced today. So that was our main thing, was working with our partnership sites and doing some other training with districts and schools across the country. So, all right, Amy, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, happy to. Welcome everyone to this session. I'm Amy Peterson, and as I mentioned in the previous session, if you were able to join, I lead out the Universal Technical Assistance for the Progress Center, which basically means all the freely available content and events that the center holds that are accessible to anyone across the country. So Stephen works more intensively with a specific set of sites, and I get to work with everyone and develop the products and tools for you all. So excited to be here, and I'll turn it over to Riley.
Thanks, Amy, and hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Riley O'Donnell, and I am a technical assistance provider at the Progress Center. I'm very lucky that I get to work with both Stephen and the intensive team and Amy and the universal team. And again, thank you for joining us. I'm looking forward to the session today.
All right, thank y'all. Yeah, and I was just kind of scanning through, seeing where a lot of people were from. So I'm seeing people from all over, Nevada, New York, Florida. So happy everybody's here to join us, and hopefully you'll get a lot out of this session, and hopefully a lot of resources for you to use and take back to your sites as well. So that's going to be our first interactive thing we're going to do here is, why did you choose to join us today? So there's several options there on the screen there. Maybe you're new to special education or supporting students with disabilities. You're interested in a refresher on the IEP. Maybe you're looking for resources to share about the IEP. Maybe you're responsible for training staff or family who are new to the IEP, or maybe there's some other reason why you joined us. So if you want to use your annotate button and maybe put a mark on one of those squares, one of those rectangles or you can pick more than one that describes the reason why you're here. Or if there's some reason not listed there on the screen, maybe put it in chat, and I'll just give everybody about 30 seconds to do that, and we'll see why most people joined us. There we go. So they're responsible for training people. There we go. And they're new to special education. I see some things popping up there. Okay, so I see in the chat there's some people they support families in the IEP process. They're responsible for training. Good. Okay. All right. Well, no matter why you're here, hopefully we're going to get something out of it. Like kind of what we described earlier today. This is kind of for the session that if you're new to special education, you're new to the IEP, that's going to be a lot of like our basic back to basics information. Or if you're responsible for training others, it's going to be you're going to see some good ways that we use our resources and hear that information that we have been talking about in our technical assistance, or things that we've created, like what Amy was talking about. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and go on now. All right. Can somebody clear off all those check marks and stuff, please? Mia or Amy. There you go. Thank you. All right. So here's what we're trying to do in our session today. So we want to identify those essential components of the IEP as it's outlined in the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA. We're going to explain how the IEP provides the foundation for promoting progress for students with disabilities. We want to understand how the parts of the IEP fit together to develop that high quality educational programming. And we're going to talk about tips, resources for developing and implementing IEPs that help to promote the progress. So those are our four main outcomes that we're looking forward to today. Okay. So the role of the IEP on the path to progress. All right. So this is, if you've seen any of our slides or any of our sessions before, some of these few slides here in the beginning are going to be pretty familiar to you. But what we believe at the Progress Center is that when we work collaboratively with students and families to develop that high educational programming in accordance with IDEA, and then also combine that with the implementation of that IEP, that's how you get that improved access and outcomes, that free appropriate public education. That's what FAPE stands for, that all students are entitled to. So when you look at our graphic here and you notice that first, a couple of things. Number one is that this equation is a multiplication equation. And I'm a former math teacher, and any of you out there that are also maybe former math teachers know that if one of these things, either the development or the implementation, if they're very low or if they're non-existent, then you know that those outcomes will be low or non-existent. These two things can't work in isolation, the development and the implementation. They both have to go together for it to be most effective. And then another thing you'll notice is the language that we use here about high quality educational programming. So we're not just talking about the development and implementation of the IEP. Okay, so we're thinking about all the things that go into a student's educational programming. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but it's not just the IEP. It's also the general education program. It's also, does a student feel like they belong? Does a student, are you using high leverage practices and things like that? So it goes beyond the IEP. That's the main thing we're kind of talk about today. But just know that when we talk about things at the Progress Center, we are trying to encompass all of that high quality educational programming that affects the student in all of their school life. All right, so just like what we were saying before, and I think you saw this slide earlier with Tessie, is when you think about special education, you think about students with disabilities, we don't want to just think about the IEP. We want to think about how well is your core programming developed and delivered to promote the progress of students with disabilities. So that core programming is for all students, including students with disabilities. So that's kind of where it starts. And then for those students with disabilities, they also have their IEP. So how well is that IEP designed and delivered to promote the progress for that student with a disability? So those two things go together is what we mean when we talk about high quality educational programming. The core programming that's set up, how is it effective for students with disabilities, and that IEP, is it set up for that student individually to make sure they can make progress in that general curriculum. This may also look familiar from earlier. This is something else that Tessie pointed out. These are our necessary ingredients for designing and delivering that high quality educational programming. And we're going to reference back to this as we go through our presentation today. It's going to come up several times. But you see that bottom step is about that collective efficacy that Tessie talked about, that belief that we can make a change in students, and we can impact students, and we have those high expectations for all students. And then we want to make sure all students feel like they belong in our school community. We want to know our students and their circumstances. We want to make sure we articulate what we want students to do. And then we want to make sure that the students have the knowledge and skills and strategies for them to meet those ambitious goals that we want to set up for them, and so they can have success in the general education classroom. So these are the steps. These are the ingredients for high quality educational programming that we will come back to throughout this presentation today. So the IDEA points out three things for sure that you need for a free, appropriate public education for FAPE. Those are procedural requirements, substantive requirements, and implementation requirements. We're going to get into more of those here in a minute, but generally you can see what they mean here on the screen. Those procedural steps are those things that are required by law, that IEPs all have to have these certain parts, right? So that's procedural. Do you have all the things that are required in the IEP? Substantive requirement is more about, do all those parts work together to form a cohesive plan that is for that student, individually designed for that student to make progress in light of whatever their circumstances is. That comes from Andrew F. You see there. And then the implementation is kind of goes back to our multiplication problem that you saw earlier. It's great to have your IEP set up well, and it may be a perfect plan, but we also need that implementation. Like, how are you using high leverage practices? How are you using good teaching techniques? And are you doing everything you need to do that's set up in that IEP to make sure that student is going to make progress in spite of in light of their circumstances. So you need all three of these together, and we're going to touch on each of these also to make sure the student has their FAPE, their free appropriate public education. All right, so something we like to do at the Progress Center, we've been using almost since the beginning probably, is using this bike analogy to kind of to show how a bike is like the parts of an IEP. So if you think about a bicycle, the parts of a bicycle, they're all bikes, just about no matter what they're used for, are going to have very similar parts. They're going to have wheels, they're going to have a frame, they're going to have handlebars, they're going to have pedals, seats, chains, all these things that are very common to what a bicycle is, the parts of a bicycle. So it's the same thing for an IEP when those procedural parts. All IEPs are going to have a present levels of academic achievement and functional performance, that PLAF statement. They're all going to have measurable annual goals, a monitoring plan, a statement of special education and services and aids, participation outside of regular education, participation in state and district-wide assessments, and the date, frequency, duration, and location of services. So those are all the parts that every IEP will have no matter what for every student. But the problem is we don't want people to just think about these parts and when they're filling out their IEPs, just fill it out, one little section after the next and not really think about how they're supposed to work together. That's really what we want people to start doing, is thinking about how these parts all work together. And that really gets into that substantive part. So that substantive part is where you have all those pieces, all those separate pieces, but then you make sure that they fit together, they work for that student, they're what that student needs. You're taking into account that what the student needs and making goals and having statement of services and aids that fit what that student needs. So that is really what makes the IEP functional, is making sure that all those parts fit together and they're not just filled out in a generic way. They're filled out with that student in mind, with what that student needs and what that student requires to be successful on their goals and in the general education curriculum. So this is just to emphasize again, there's a ton of different types of bikes out there. There's mountain bikes, there's road bikes, there's bicycles built for two, there's beach cruisers, there's all different types of parts that look very similar. They're all going to have those similar parts. But it depends on what you want to use that bike for how it's designed. So same thing for an IEP. It depends on what that student needs and what's going to help them be successful. How is that IEP going to look for that student when it has all those parts that you're required? How are we going to fit those parts together to make sure it's for that student? It's individualized. So what is a great IEP if it doesn't guide implementation? So that's that third part of that FAPE requirement. We could have all of our parts of our IEP. We can make sure all those parts fit together in a substantive way, but we also need that implementation to be of high quality, because it doesn't matter, again, if you have the perfect plan set up, you also need to have the teachers and the resources and the things to make sure that it's implemented the way we need it to for that student. So when we look at case studies throughout the different case laws, these are the two things that come up most often in the reviews of those case laws: fidelity of implementation and capacity to implement. So when you're trying to implement this high quality educational programming, the first thing we think about is the fidelity of implementation. Are you implementing that IEP as it's intended? Are you doing all the things you said you were going to do in that IEP? Are you providing all the services, all the duration, all the frequency and intensity, the way it's set up that that student is supposed to get to make sure that they're successful in school? So that's the first thing. Are you doing what you said you were going to do? The second part there, capacity to implement, just means, do you have the staff to do what you said you're going to do? Does that staff have the knowledge and skills to effectively implement the IEP? Do you have all the resources you need to implement the IEP? So that's what that capacity to implement means, is, do you have the staff? Do they have the knowledge? Do you have all the resources that is required for that student to use that to benefit from that IEP? And that's the only way really you can determine if that IEP is successful or not, is you have to implement it with fidelity, and you have to implement it using people that have the skills and the resources they need to implement. Otherwise, you don't know. You don't know, like, if it was successful because, or it wasn't successful because of the plan that was set up. So it's really important to make sure you implement with fidelity and you have the people and resources necessary to implement it. as designed. So this is our road, our path to progress, right? That we'll reference this a bunch of times too. So that IEP is just one little part of what we're talking about, this path to process. You can see all the things that along the way that are also help, such as educator supports, family engagement, student belonging, all those things that you see on the road. And if we have that good IEP set up, we're gonna, if we're riding our bike along this path of progress, we're gonna hit roadblocks, we're gonna hit potholes, we're gonna come to hills. That are going to be obstacles along the way, but we can make sure that we're prepared, and we make sure we have our staff prepared to make sure and they have the necessary skills and knowledge and support to navigate around those obstacles, and to make sure we're still keeping on track with what that student needs. So just like the bicycle, it's going to be, if it's missing any parts, it's not going to, it's not going to be as successful. If you have a bicycle that's missing the pedals, it's going to be hard to pedal that bicycle down the road. So just like, with an IEP, if you're missing a part, either in the procedural, just a required part, or you haven't designed it for that student, then they're not going to make that progress that we need them to do. They're going to struggle, and it's going to be more costly than it needs to be along the way. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Amy to talk about our back to the basics, our IEP, the parts of the IEP.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. And so we're going to first talk about like the overarching parts of the IEP, and then we'll jump into some of kind of the key critical parts a little bit deeper. And Stephen and Riley will talk about those in just a second. But as we're getting started with the parts of the IEP, I want to start off with a quick quiz for folks. And one of the things that I want you to think about as we think about this quiz is, per the IDEA, how many requirements do all IEPs have? Now, you might have heard Tessie talk about this in the intro, or you might know this, but lots of different states have additional requirements. We also have times where in the course of students' educational programming, or based on their individual needs, they might need additional components of the IEP considered. But how many are those critical requirements for all IEPs according to IDEA? So go ahead and mark down one. If it's a 1, it's 5 components. If it's a 2, it's 7 components. If it's 3, it's 9 components. If it's a 4, it's 11. How many do you think it is? So go ahead and take a second to answer that. And if you were paying attention a couple slides earlier, Stephen told you those components. All right, I see a couple 3s in there. Some 2s, 3s. All right. Let's go ahead and reveal the answer. So if we think about those required components for all IEPs, we have those 7 required components for all IEPs. Now, again, at different points in time in students' instructional programming, they might have additional components in the IEP. For example, as students become transition age, we obviously need to ensure that we have the transition services, or the age of majority, and some of those other components. But as Stephen talked about on that slide with the bicycle, we need to make sure that we have these critical 7 components in all IEPs, regardless of students' grade level experience and so on. And so we need to ensure we have that presence levels of academic achievement and functional performance statement, or the PLAF statement, the measurable annual goals, the measuring progress toward the annual goals or monitoring plan, lots of different language for some of these, the statement of special education aids and services, the explanation for education setting, the participation in the assessment, and the date, frequency, duration, and location of services. So let's dig in and look at those a little bit more. We're going to do a quick activity here that allows you to look at this tip sheet that we have put together through the Progress Center. This is one of a wide collection of tip sheets that we have available. Actually, if you look at this, you'll notice that this one actually includes additional components of the IEP, like transition services and age of majority, that are included on there for you to reference. We're going to give you about 3 minutes to individually take a look at this. Mia just dropped in the chat, so you can go ahead and click on that document, open it up. If you download it, if you have highlighting capability in your PDF format, you can go ahead and do that, or you can just take some notes or think about it. If you're coming to this session in the orientation of somebody who might be training others, or might be really helping to think about some of the logistical components of monitoring or other things, go ahead and think from that perspective. What are some of the key things that stand out to you that are takeaways, the things that you might want to emphasize in training or supports for others? If you're new to the IEP development, you're new to this content, go ahead and look at it in that way. You can also, you'll see on that far column, there's links there to additional tip sheets the Progress Center has developed for each of the components of the IEP, as well as the IDEA regulations themselves. So you can take a second to explore some of that. So I'm going to give you 3 minutes to do that individually or independently. Then we're going to put you in small breakout groups for about 5 minutes to really have a conversation about some of the things that stood out to you, or questions or wonderings that you have some conversation in groups. And then we'll bring it back together as a whole group and have some conversation here. So take 3 minutes now, pull that up. If you have any trouble getting access to it, just let us know. And then we'll go ahead in about 3 minutes. We'll throw you into breakout rooms. You'll go over into your breakout rooms. Go ahead and turn your cameras on for that part to have some conversation. We won't be recording your breakout rooms. Have that conversation with your peers, and then we'll bring it back together as a whole group. All right. So you can go on mute. You can go off your cameras. Go ahead and take about 2 to 3 minutes to take a look at that tip sheet. All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I think we've got people transitioning back in from the breakout room, so we'll give you just a second to do that. And hopefully you had a little bit of time to reflect on the tip sheets, take a look at those, and have some conversations in your small group. I'm curious if anyone from any of the small groups want to share out some of the things that they were thinking about or questions that they had as they were looking at the tip sheets.
Okay, I'll say something.
Oh, thank you.
In my group, we just discussed how this is, for one of the ladies, she stated this was good for parents to have an understanding and to better learn about the process if they need some help. For myself, this is good for, we have an increase in numbers, and so I have a lot of substitutes right now that I'm trying to fill with teachers. But this is very helpful to my new teachers as well as substitutes who might not be so fluent. And I think it's amazing for general ed as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. And actually, we do have a parent version of this tip sheet, which I will put in the chat for you all to access, that just customizes it obviously to language about your child or things like that versus the students and so on. And I see a question there about, do we have the tip sheets in Spanish? And as of last week, all of those tip sheets that are available in the tip sheet series are available in Spanish. So if you go to the landing page for where the tip sheets live, and the one that I just put in for the parent one, you'll see the Spanish version of that one lives on that page with that one. Same thing with all of the other tip sheets. So those are all available now in Spanish for you as well. So there's one, as you see, that goes along with each of the components of the statement or of the IEP. So the present levels and the goals and so on. And there are Spanish versions of all of those. We are also working with a parent center to translate these into Korean, and they're doing the hard, heavy lifting of the translation and working through those. So they are not all finalized at this point yet, but once those are up and available, we'll definitely communicate about that as well. So that's coming soon as versions of these in Korean as well. But I think another question that we had in one of our group is, can you use these and share them? And we would love for you to take them, use them, share them in all of your work and trainings that you do. Please feel free to use them. And then one of the other things that stood out in the conversation in my group was sometimes all of the additional components that we have added at the state level or at the policies and practice levels to kind of the basics of the IEP, that if we look back at IDEA, what is really there and what is laid out for us. And so sometimes we create all of this additional challenge for ourselves as we're navigating this process. So thinking about kind of what are those critical components as we look at this. Great. Anyone else?
the supplements that came with each of the pages or each of the tips was very helpful, especially to make sure that we don't do cookie cutter IEPs. That's what kind of came up in our group, where making sure that when they're talking about the locations, for different things is different for each child, or that we actually apply them when dealing with the students, and also that we're not just cutting and pasting goals from one quarter to the next, one year to the next, one child to the next, but that each of them can be unique. So all of those were very helpful to make sure that we are customizing those IEPs.
Yeah, I love that too. And I think it's one of those things that sometimes when we're in the moment, we're not always thinking about like what we're doing with doing some cutting and pasting or something like that. But if we really step back and the goal of the IEP document and using it to drive implementation, like Stephen was talking about, well, if we're not really designing something that really will allow us to be individualized to that student, it's much harder for us to do that. So yeah, love that. Great, thank you, everyone. Well, feel free to keep adding those things in the chat as we go forward, but I'll skip next to the next slide with just a couple of the did you knows, and I think these kind of came out over the course of some of your conversations as well, right? So when IDEA outlines all of those required components of the IEP, but it doesn't define what the IEP document must look like. And you probably, if you have worked across different states, probably know this, or different times in different states, probably know this, because you have seen different IEP documents, what they look like, what they feel like. And to the point, the conversation that we had, right, is sometimes we create additional kind of structures in our IEP documents that make it a little bit harder for us to understand the different key components of our IEP. And so I'll talk about a resource in just a second that might be helpful in that. And then the other thing that I mentioned earlier, but it's something to really reinforce, is that all states have to meet those minimum requirements set by IDEA, right? So if we look back at the IDEA language as the basics, the piece that everyone has to have, states can add on additional requirements and to support development and implementation, but they have to ensure that we have at minimum those requirements set by IDEA. So you might see that your states have slightly different requirements, right? But we have to make sure that at a base, we have all of those required components from IDEA. And when you'll hear us talking, kind of we lean toward kind of that IDEA language because we have folks from across the country kind of working with us, right? But in your different states and your context, it's important to know kind of the requirements for your individual states and sites. So I just mentioned that one of the big challenges that we saw and some of the things that we learned in working with some of our sites was that it was sometimes hard to pick out the parts of the IEP, those critical components in the IEP documents that we have, right? Sometimes the IEP document itself creates so much challenge in understanding what is the present level statement in part of that IEP, or what are the specially designed instruction? Where is that actually in my IEP? Where are my measurable annual goals and so on? And so this getting to know your IEP document, and I think Mia just dropped a link to it in the chat for you all if you want to pull it up, and it's linked on the landing page as well. So if you want to get back to it easily, you can. Really is just a helpful way to kind of think through or help people look at different IEPs and look at the different components. So you can use this with the IEP in your state or so on, and just understand like where is the present level statement? Where are the measurable annual goals? And this might be another helpful resource when you're working with parents and families, or you're working with general educators who are less familiar with how the IEP is structured than you might be, to help them really understand and unpack kind of where are those different parts of the IEP itself, because sometimes it's not all in one location, right? And so if we really look at kind of our documents, where are those critical pieces, and making sure that we have those critical pieces and that we understand where they are and how we can use them. Stephen talked a little bit about this as he talked about the parts of the bike coming together, and Tessie mentioned it as well as we started the work of the session in the general session this morning. But one of the big pieces that we have really found is so critical as we talk about this IEP development is the internal consistency, right? We can have really high quality parts and those parts of the bike as the standalone parts, but if they don't fit together, it's really not going to provide us with a rideable bicycle, right? So we think about these kind of parts of the IEP and how they connect and how they fit together. So if you click forward, we can see some of these components, right? So we know that the present level statement has to drive the statement of special education services and the participation decisions about participation outside of regular education, district and statewide assessments, and those service placements and the date, frequency, duration, and location of those services. That present level statement really helps us, the needs identified there really helps us to develop and justify all of those decisions we're making as an IEP team. Similarly, it drives our annual goals and helping us set those annual goals, right? So those needs identified in the present level statements help us define those goals. And the goals help us to measure whether or not our special education and services and aids and all of that is working for the student. And if not, they're helping us to understand whether or not our annual goals are actually measuring kind of those key components of the services we're providing. And the monitoring plan is that ongoing monitoring, right, of those annual goals over time to tell us whether or not what we've designed is working, right? So we've got all of these parts, all of these different components of the IEP that need to work in concert, work together in order to really help us drive a successful program for students with disabilities. So those kind of interactive components here we'll refer back to, and you'll see throughout the presentation today, making those connections and really thinking about that present level statement as that critical piece, right? Rachel was talking about, making sure it's not cookie cutter, right? So really thinking about the needs of the student in order to design the programming for students. On the very back side of the tip sheet, you probably saw this piece about the IEP development. And this is just a couple reminders as we think about kind of developing the initial IEP and then reviewing and updating the IEP over time. So we want to make sure that as we're developing the initial IEP, that we're following the procedural requirements for timelines and so on. And so making sure that if we've determined during a comprehensive evaluation that the student requires that special education services, that we're convening the IEP team within 30 calendar days in order to develop that initial IEP, that team is coming together to review the information and develop the IEP during that initial meeting. And then actually putting that IEP into place, right? That implementation piece, making sure that we're implementing that IEP over time and sharing those updates with parents and families according to the monitoring plan. And then over time, after we've developed that initial IEP, we're really going to continue to meet on an ongoing basis at least once a year in order to determine whether the student is making progress to those goals, right? And whether new services or supports or there's new needs that have been identified for the student. And the other thing that we want to make sure that we're pointing out here is, right, like at a minimum, once a year, right? But that doesn't mean that we can only meet once a year. If needed, if the team identifies that we need to meet more than one time per year, that's totally fine. We need to use this to be a useful tool for us, right? So we're meeting on an ongoing basis in order to ensure students are making progress. That at least a year is our minimum, but we can determine that we want to meet more frequently. And then over time, we're reevaluating the student based on their needs and so on to ensure that we're designing an IEP that's appropriate. So every 3 years that we'll be doing the reevaluation piece as well. As we think about who needs to be on an IEP, you can see a version of a tip sheet we have for parents and families here about the IEP team themselves, but those critical components as outlined in IDEA for who needs to be on the IEP. So ensuring that we have the parents of the child, no less than one regular education teacher of the child, no less than one special education of the teacher of the child, or when appropriate, a special education provider of the child, a representative of the public agency, an individual who can interpret the instructional implications of the evaluation results. And so someone who knows those data pieces and can help us to understand the evaluation results and so on. And it might be others who have knowledge or special expertise regarding the child. And when appropriate, the child with the disability themselves. I saw in the intro session when Glenna was asking about kind of our norms and non-negotiables, so many people shared the importance of ensuring the student themselves was part of the decision-making process in their educational programming and so on, right? So we want to make sure that we are ensuring that the child with a disability is involved and engaged in the IEP team as much as appropriate, and at a minimum when they turn 16. If we think about the IDEA regulations, in many states, that's earlier than that. So again, knowing your state regulations is important there as we think about our transition services for students. But as early grades, those students can be engaged and involved in the decision-making, whether or not that's at the meeting or prior to the meeting and so on, ensuring their voice is part of that teaming process. But that team is really the collective group that knows the student well across the different environments that they're participating in, right? And ensuring that we are developing a plan and a program that is really effective for them. And so as we think back to kind of the goals of this work, and that the theme of this sessions and conference, we really talked about like collective efficacy and we're better together. And so I think in the intro session, Tessie mentioned this idea of us being better together. And you can see that on the next slide. Oh, I guess I skipped ahead a slide. So one of the things just to point out and remember is that sometimes an IEP team member can serve in multiple roles, right? So we might have a special education teacher who also has experience and expertise in interpreting the evaluation results. So thinking about kind of the members of the team, there may be folks that sit in those multiple roles. But on the next slide, I believe we refer back to our collective efficacy piece and thinking about kind of that development and bringing everyone to the table in that IEP team as a clear team members and making sure that it is a collaborative experience, right? As we're designing programming for students, because we can't do it alone. We know we don't have the time, the knowledge, the skills to meet all the needs of everyone. And so it is really all of us working together. It's the related service providers and family members and additional staff and special education teachers and general education teachers and principals and medical professionals and paraprofessionals and others, community members, really working together to support students with disabilities and to ensure progress for them, right? So that might be in the IEP meeting for some key critical roles. It might be in the implementation of that programming and the experience for the student across their school setting. So really that kind of collaborative nature of this IEP development and implementation is so critical. So I want to just check and see if there's any big questions or things that are on your mind as we transition out of this kind of laying the foundation section and then digging deeper into some of the components. All right, well, I'm waiting on my teacher pause, but I also want to make sure that we give you guys a chance to take a short break before we jump into the next section, because I know this is a long kind of Strand session. So we have split up our break, our 15-minute break, into two smaller breaks. So this is our first break, our 10-minute break. So we'll come back together at the top of the hour at 2 o'clock, because on my clock, it's 1:49 now. So you get the extra minute because it's probably going to turn to 1:50 in just a second. So go ahead, turn off your cameras, mute your lines, and go ahead and grab some food, drinks, take a stretch, and so on. We'll come back together at 2 o'clock on Eastern time or at top of the hour, wherever you are.
All right, welcome back, everyone. We are at the top of the hour, so we are going to go ahead and get back started. We're now going to transition and focus on developing high-quality IEPs that promote progress and knowing the student's circumstances. So looking at particular at that PLAF statement. So if you attended our opening session this morning, you might have heard Dr. Tessie Bailey speak about the necessary ingredients for designing and delivering high-quality educational programming for students with disabilities. And Stephen touched on this briefly in the beginning of this session as well. So in this section of the Strand session, we are going to concentrate on that third step, which is knowing the students and their circumstances. And we know that it's important to understand your students and their needs in order for you to develop an IEP that addresses their specific needs. So revisiting this slide about connecting the PLAF to the parts of the IEP. The information in the PLAF statement is the starting point from which educators can specify appropriate goals, services, supports, and progress monitoring plans. We know that the PLAF statement needs to be comprehensive and detailed enough so that the team can set appropriately ambitious goals in light of the child's individual circumstances and plan appropriate supports and services for the student. So if you look at the quote here on the bottom of this slide, the U.S. Department of Education states that there should be a direct relationship between the present levels of performance and the other components of the IEP. I'll give you a second to read the rest of that quote up there. Then moving forward and coming back to this Andrew F. decision, and we know that under IDEA, the IEP serves as the foundation of promoting progress for students with disabilities. We know that a well-designed IEP ensures that students have access to special education and related services, supplementary aids and services to access and benefit from high-quality core programming, as well as other services and supports necessary for progress towards ambitious goals. So looking back and thinking back on that Andrew F. decision, as you can see in the emphasized text on the slides, the Andrew F. Supreme Court decision states that an IEP must be reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress appropriate in light of that child's circumstances. So again, it's important that we know our students and their unique needs and circumstances to develop and implement a student's IEP. So to get us talking again with some partners, we are going to do another breakout activity called Knowing Your Student. So thinking about introductions and assignments is going to be the first step here. You are going to be broken off into groups of 2 or 3, and we invite you to share just a quick 15-second introduction with yourself and your partner, and then number off 1, 2, and 3. If you were numbered off and you're a person number 1, you're going to think and identify a student with a disability who you know well. In 3 minutes or less, give a quick description of the student's disability, how it affects the student's education, and what you think needs to happen for the student to be successful in the classroom. Persons 2 and 3, you're going to listen while person 1 shares and take some notes or some mental notes about the impact of the disability, as well as the primary and secondary needs of that student. When person 1 finishes their description of the student, take a minute or 2 to ask questions for clarification. Then, as a group, come together and take 2 minutes to confirm your description of the student, their needs, and what supports you think would be best for that student. Okay, welcome back, everyone. We hope that that gives you some time to have some good discussions with your group. We are going to take a second now that we are all back in here and move on to a group discussion. So reflecting on this activity and on your discussion with your groups, first thinking, what were some key takeaways from this activity? Another question to think about is how easy or difficult was it to describe the student? This can be if you were person 1 or person 2, thinking about the impact or the needs. And thirdly, how does this activity facilitate meaningful engagement of families and other educators in the planning and development of the IEP? And we invite you to come off of mute and share your answers with the group, or you can drop it in the chat as well.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes, we can, thank you.
Okay, I'm Susan Burris, and my person 1 did a very fine job with describing the student. We were getting into the pieces that would show support for the student, both in the classroom and beyond the classroom. And that's why I said, I wish we had more time, but I also understand you have to adhere to certain time limits yourself. So she did a very good job.
Thank you.
I'm going to share.
Yeah, awesome.
Hi, I'm Jackie Working. I'm based here in Las Vegas, Nevada. And I would say for our group, there's a little bit of advantage because I already know the people that I was in the group with. So our person 1 did a great job describing, although I don't know the student, directly. she did a great job describing, the needs of the student. And then of course, the three of us collaborated on what the child will probably benefit from as far as services and supports. And one thing I want to point is, because I already know them outside of the progress session, I feel that that's beneficial, when you're looking at your IEP team, right? If you know each other as much as you know the child, I think that's an advantage for the child, because you are all going to collaborate effectively on how you can support the child. So that's what I wanted to share.
Absolutely. Thank you. Seeing some other responses come in the chat, that it's critical to get to know your students and their families. Oh, sorry, Patricia, go ahead.
Well, I also think it's important to continue to be curious and ask questions. So my experience is that each team member who works with that child sees something a little different. And so all of that together compiles that particular student. And if you are curious and continue to ask questions and look within the child, then I think that your team can better service them.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something that we've seen working with some of our partnership sites that Stephen has mentioned as well. This is a good activity and a quick activity that you can do prior to the IEP team meeting to be prepared. It's easy to gather those who are familiar with the students. This can be general education teachers, related service providers, even folks like bus drivers or after school providers. And you can come together to really summarize those results and share them in advance so that everyone comes in with that well-rounded knowledge and understanding of the student, and again, gives them a space to ask questions with others who may be more familiar with students in different settings than they are. So thank you for sharing that. All right, we invite you to keep answering and putting some thoughts in the chat. And again, this is a great activity to shift the focus from the IEP document itself to really understanding that student and the student's needs. So moving forward, this PLAF statement really is the foundation for the IEP, and it provides the foundation on which the rest of the IEP is built. So just like building a house, it's important that we have a high quality PLAF statement foundation to build the rest of the IEP. And thinking about the child's level of academic achievement and functional performance is the foundation on which the IEP should be built. And without a clear identification of those present levels, the IEP cannot set measurable goals, evaluate the child's progress, and determine which educational and related services are needed. So thinking about some key questions for designing the PLAF statement, and these questions become essential for helping us develop a high-quality PLAF statement that serves as a foundation for the IEP. Specifically, we need to think and define the following. So what do we want for our student, as described in the PLAF statement and in the measurable annual goals? Thinking about what is the student's current reality and their unique circumstances, again, described in the PLAF statement. What does the student need to be successful, described in the PLAF statement and outlined in the IEP aids and services? And how can we maximize our resources to support the student, described in the placement and implementation of the IEP? So when thinking about these first three questions specifically, they're essential for helping us to know our student and to work collaboratively with other members of the team to develop a strong PLAF statement in IEP. So let's take a minute to review what IDEA says about the PLAF statement. IDEA specifically says that the PLAF statement is a statement of the child's present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. One thing that you might notice stands out here is that there is an and, which we have highlighted here in red, between academic achievement and functional performance. And this is important because information about the student's academic achievement and functional performance is essential because IEP teams must ensure that students with disabilities have supports that address all areas of need. This means that even if a student does not have an academic or functional performance need, both must be addressed in the PLAF statement. Another thing that you might have noticed here is the word statement right in the beginning. So when thinking about the PLAF statement, it is a single statement. In a state or district's IEP template, the information that is included in the PLAF statement may be in separate parts of the IEP, but it is all part of one comprehensive statement. You will also notice in the definition from IDEA that for school-age children, the PLAF statement includes how the child's disability affects the child's involvement and progress in the general education curriculum. By that, we mean that the same curriculum that their non-disabled peers are receiving. Similarly, for preschool children, the PLAF statement outlines how the disability affects the children's participation in appropriate activities. And we do have this tip sheet, as you can see the screenshot on the right there, which dives a little bit deeper into the PLAF statement itself. So as we just learned, the PLAF statement must include a summary of performance for both academic achievement and functional performance. So what is meant by present levels of academic achievement? And although IDEA regulations do not define academic achievement, the U.S. Department of Education, in its response to some questions, provided additional clarification by explaining that academic achievement generally refers to a child's performance in academic areas. Now, this could vary depending on the child's unique circumstances or situation, and therefore a formal definition is not included in the regulations. But when thinking about areas covered by academic achievement, you might think about a student's performance in needs in math classes or science, history, writing, or reading, for example. Now, what is meant by present levels of functional performance? And once again, we know that the PLAF statement must also include a summary of performance for functional performance and needs. Functional performance generally refers to the activities that are not considered academic or related to a child's academic achievement. Functional often is used in the context of routine activities of everyday living. And the range of functional skills is as varied as the individual needs of children with disabilities. So think to yourself, what are some examples of functional skills that you typically see in your IEPs? And take a moment just to reflect before we move on and share some examples of typical or functional skills that are typically seen in those IEPs that you write or work with. All right, and the next slide. So let's think about some examples of some functional skills. And, some common things that might have came to mind were dressing, eating, toileting, or mobility. But there are some others too that are important to consider, such as social skills, which I saw someone mention in the chat, communication, executive function, and behavior. And these bottom four boxes specifically could impact all students, regardless of the disability. Sometimes we've seen that it can be a struggle for IEP teams to identify functional skills that are needed because educators may not know that the skills are needed to learn. But these are all equally as important to address and consider when developing the IEP for each individual student. So let's break apart this PLAF statement. And although IDEA regulations do not specify the structure of the PLAF statement, the IEP team can begin the process of developing a high-quality PLAF statement by focusing on four main components. The first one being student needs, information on the student's current academic and/or functional needs, as just described. The effect on progress in general education. This can be described as an explanation of how the disability affects the student's involvement and progress in the general education curriculum or classroom. Baseline information, or baseline data for monitoring student progress. So thinking about data that relates to the student's identified areas of need. And connection to goals and/or services, which is the bridge between the PLAF statement and measurable annual goals and services. So we need to make sure there is enough information in the PLAF statement to develop ambitious and measurable annual goals and to determine what services are needed. We'll talk a little bit more about goals and services later in these sessions. And again, these four components are described on the bottom of the section of the PLAF tip sheet to go in a little bit more detail on examples and more information on writing a strong PLAF statement. So avoiding assume-aside. If designed well, the PLAF statement prevents us from experiencing the dreaded and harmful, what we call assume-aside. And what are the dangers of making assumptions here? You know, when we assume, we make decisions about programming or identify practices or supports based on our assumptions or beliefs rather than evidence. And this is why the PLAF statement is so important, because it prevents us from making assumptions about the student and really ensuring that we know the student and their unique needs and circumstances. So let's think about some considerations when developing the PLAF statement. You have to make sure that the PLAF statement is based on the individual needs that a child experiences because of their disability. The IEP must be developed based on the student's unique needs and, according to the Supreme Court, as we recalled from Andrew F., reasonably calculated to enable the child to make progress appropriate in light of their unique circumstances. So again, the PLAF statement is not based on the disability category, and this is how we refrain from those cookie cutter or copy and paste IEPs, is really based on the student's needs and their individual circumstances. And it's important to consider these things when developing the PLAF statement for your students. And lastly, what does the U.S. Department of Education say about the PLAF statement? First, they say that a district cannot lawfully prepare IEPs with the same statement of current levels of performance for all students in a specific program. Again, it must be unique to the child and the child's needs. And it is impermissible for districts to have the IEP for each student in a class/disability category contain identical statements of present levels of educational performance. And this is important, again, thinking about the fact that we don't want those copy and paste IEPs, and why it's important to take the time to really understand and know the student before going into the IEP team meetings to develop these PLAF statements and the rest of the IEP. And Amy talked about previously, the idea of collective efficacy and how everyone must be on board to really provide the high quality educational programming for these students. And the same goes when developing a PLAF statement, and it's the power of the teams to make sure it is high quality. And the PLAF statement is a collective statement that should include multiple perspectives from the student, the parents, general educators, related service providers, special educators, and others who know and work with the student. And looking here in this blue box, a tip for progress, this should be a total team effort. You can go and collect and summarize data for the development of the PLAF statement prior to the IEP team meeting to help facilitate more robust discussion. The collection of these data can and should begin prior to the IEP team meeting to both ensure that all areas of concern are captured and to facilitate more robust discussion during the meeting. And you can learn more about some of these resources later in this session that will talk about resources developed for parents and students that can be used to help gather their input prior to the IEP meeting and prior to developing that IEP. And once that IEP team meets to discuss the 4 elements of a high quality PLAF statement, they can continue to assemble the necessary data and information that will allow them to collaboratively write the PLAF statement, which is, as we learned, the foundation of the IEP. And with that, I'm going to pass it back over to Stephen, and he's going to get us started talking about indicators of progress.
All right. Thanks, Riley. Yes, indicators of progress. So that's going to be the next part of our stair step that they're going to return to now. So when you think about the necessary ingredients of high quality educational programming, what we're going to talk about is articulating what we want the students to do. So that's going to be what we're talking about, our indicators of progress. So in this slide here, this information, if you saw the openings talk with Tessie, Dr. Bailey, you saw a slide similar to this. It was a newer slide, but it kind of talked about the IEP goal, how that leads to grade level progress, performance on national and state accountability measures, and the post-school success. So it's the same kind of information that we saw earlier. Since we are kind of concentrating specifically on the IEP, we're really going to talk about that first step there, the IEP goal progress. But just to kind of remind you kind of what Tessie was talking about earlier, that each student with a disability is working on their individual goals on their IEP, right? But those goals and the things that they're getting through special education are supposed to help them achieve on their grade level progress. And then all students in a grade level have to take some sort of national or state accountability measure. And all three of those together kind of give you information about how is the student doing? Do we need to make adjustments on how we're the supports we have set up for the student? Do we need to make adjustments on the type of instruction we're giving this student? Because the ultimate goal is that post-school success. All those things before that are just indicators on how the student is doing, so we can make sure that student is successful once they get out of school. But again, we're going to concentrate more today on the IEP goal progress. So let's talk about goals a little bit more. So going back to our graphic that kind of shows how everything's connected together. Just a reminder, those annual goals they come from those needs in the PLAF statement. So not every need in the PLAF statement is going to need a goal. You know, it's better. We don't want a student to have 20 goals, because that's probably not realistic for that student to work towards and to try to achieve. But there's things on that PLAF statement that we call like primary needs. What are the most important things, the important needs that we need to address from that PLAF statement? Those are the things we want to have goals on. And then just a reminder, all the needs in the PLAF statement will have some sort of like special education or aids and services attached to it to address all the needs in the PLAF statement. And some of those needs that are also goals are going to be attached to those same special education aids and services that are there in the statement of aids and services. And then that's going to tell us if the student is making progress on those goals. It's going to tell us yes or no, do we have the right services set up? And if we don't, then we can make adjustments, just like what Amy was talking about earlier. You don't only have to meet once a year to talk about the services the student gets. If that student's not making progress on those goals, then you need to meet. It's your duty to meet and make adjustments to those services and aids that student is getting to make sure that they can make progress on those annual goals. All right, so going back to Andrew Reff, because this is another part. This is a big reason the Progress Center came about, and one of our main things that we like to emphasize is we need to make sure that the IEP is reasonably calculated for that student to make progress in light of the child's circumstances. So that's the same thing. That's how our goals are really important in this area. The goals are going to show these are the things the student needs to be successful in general education and then after school and that post-school success. So if that student is not making progress in light of their circumstances, we need to figure out why. Like the essential function of the IEP is to make a plan for that student to be successful academically and functionally while they're in school for that post-school success. So why are measurable annual goals so important? So we've kind of mentioned some of these already, but number one is they address some of those specific academic and functional needs that are outlined in the PLAF statement. Number two is we also, it helps to have those high expectations. Those goals ensure we have high expectations and alignment to the grade level activities. So just to clarify that a little bit, it doesn't mean that you have to take the exact grade level skill for a student and then make that their IEP goal. That may not be appropriate for that student, but you do want to align whatever skill that student's working with or working towards, that it does align to grade level skills that other students in their grade level are working towards. So make sure that grade level alignment for those measurable annual goals. And then last thing there, they assess whether that programming is helping that student to make progress. So are the services and aids and special design instruction that we have set up, are they helping that student make progress on their goals? And if not, then how do we need to adjust that specially designed instructions, aids and services to make sure that student does make progress on the goals? You never want to lower the goal, right? You already have the goal set based on the baseline information, based on the ambitious goal you're trying to set for that student. So you don't want to lower that. You just may need to adjust what you're doing to help the student reach those goals. All right, so how do goals connect to the other components in the IEP? So this is just another, you're about to see another graphic of how we kind of explain how goals fit with everything else. So you have your PLAF statement. Your PLAF statement, just like what Riley said, includes that baseline. Like, where is the student now? That's going to let us know where we're going to build it for the next 12 months, because your goal is kind of that projection of, if we know the student is here in our PLAF statement at this baseline, where do we anticipate, or where do we think is realistic but ambitious for them to be 12 months from now, 1 year from now? So that's kind of how those are connected. So in between there is going to be all the services, the aids, the special education, the specially designed instruction, all the things that you're going to put together to help that student get from that PLAF statement, that baseline, to the goal that you set for them. So all those special education services are going to be set up to help that student get from that baseline to where you want them to be 12 months from now. And in between there, you're going to have that monitoring plan that's going to be able to check, is that student making the progress that we're expecting them to make? And if not, then we need to look at making some adjustments to that plan, because we don't want a whole year to go by and we know that that student's not making the progress that they should, and then we just come to the end of the year and we're like, oops, oh, they didn't make the progress, they didn't meet that goal. When during the year you should have those dates set up where you're looking at that data to make sure that that student's on track to meet that annual goal. And if not, then how can you adjust it? What needs to be adjusted to help that student reach that annual goal? All right, so let's take a look at what the IDEA says about goals. And again, this is another one of our tip sheets. So if you go to our website and look at the tip sheets, there's one specifically about measurable annual goals. So you can see that part 1 there, it says the statement of measurable annual goals has to include academic and functional goals designed to meet the child's needs that result from the child's disability and to enable that child to be involved in and make progress in the general education curriculum. So that's something we've mentioned several times there. Part B says to meet all the other child's educational needs that result from the child's disability. So look at that part 2 there. It's a little bit different, and this may be different based on what state you're in. But it says for children with disabilities who take an alternate assessment, you have to have alternate academic achievement standards with benchmarks or short-term objectives. So I know some states make all students who have an IEP have benchmarks or short-term objectives, but that's not what IDEA requires. IDEA only requires that for those students who take an alternate assessment. So some states may make you do that, and some states may not make you do that. So just know what the requirements are in your state. It's one of those where the minimum is that you have to have children who take the alternate assessment have to have those benchmarks or short-term objectives. Some states make all their students with IEPs have those. All right, so just one thing or a few things to remember about IEP goals. One, they focus on student behavior, not educator behavior. So it's what do we want the student to do, the student to achieve, not what do we want the educators to do or to do differently or to achieve. Make sure you monitor those with enough frequency so you can determine, are they making the progress they need to? Or if not, do we need to make adjustments to what we're doing for the student? And make sure it's also measured by using objective, valid, and reliable measures. And there we list several examples of things that could be reliable measures. So you don't want to just rely on things like teacher anecdotal notes. Those are important. You know, it's important to know what the teacher's seeing in the classroom. It's important to know what the teacher's opinion is of the student, but you also want to use that with some objective, valid, and reliable measures. And the last thing there is be realistic, but ambitious. And you'll kind of see some examples here in a minute about what we mean by ambitious versus realistic when we talk about our annual goals. All right, so this did you know that an IEP goal, a single IEP goal, can address multiple needs outlined in the PLAF statement. So an example of this is that you could have an oral reading fluency goal that's related to reading proficiency, but it might also support students who have needs related to sight words, phonics, and fluency. So you can have that one goal help you to address all of those needs instead of having 4 different goals. You know, one for sight words, one for phonics, one for fluency. All could be achieved just by having that oral reading fluency goal. All right, so here are the three essential elements of measurable annual goals that we're going to talk a little bit about. Target behavior, condition, and the level of proficiency in the timeline. So what the target behavior is what is the skill that we want the student to achieve? What is it that we want them to change and to learn about? So what's the academic or the functional skill that we're trying to teach that student? The second thing there, the condition, is when do we expect the student to do this target behavior? What context or what environment are we expecting the student to do this target behavior? Is it a certain grade level skill? Is it a certain environment that we want to see this behavior happen? So that's what we mean by the condition. The last thing there says level of proficiency and timeline. So level of proficiency means how are we going to know when that student reaches this goal? You know, what are we going to expect the student to do for us to say the student has reached this goal, so we believe that they can be successful with it? Sometimes it's a level of proficiency, sometimes it's a time frame, sometimes it's both together. So that's why they're kind of together on the same square. It could be a level of proficiency, it could be a time frame, or it could be both things together. And I'm going to show you some examples here in a minute that's going to show you what we mean by a level of proficiency or a timeline. But all three of these together, they're important for what's to make a goal to be considered measurable. So when we say measurable annual goal, we need a target behavior, a condition, and a level of proficiency and a timeline. All right, so here's some examples that I was just mentioning that we were going to go over today. So we're going to look at an academic example. So for an academic goal, it needs to be, we want that student to learn skills that are necessary for them to access and benefit from the general education instruction, okay? So here's our first example. So this is a draft goal. It says, Jesse will read 65 words per minute. All right, so if we look at our three essential elements that we have, do we have a condition here? Well, we don't have a condition. We don't know, like, are we talking about a certain grade level they have to read on? Are we talking about that they're going to read grade level material? Like, what is it? We don't know what condition that we're talking about in this goal, okay? Target behavior, we do have, it says we want Jesse to read 65 words per minute. So we can say we have a target behavior for this goal. But level of proficiency and timeline, we don't really have that. We don't know, how are we going to know that when he reaches that level of proficiency for reading 65 words per minute? Does he need to do it a certain amount of days in a row? Does he need to do it a certain amount of time? Does it need to be done by a certain date? So that's not really, that doesn't really explain in this goal exactly what we want that level of proficiency or timeline to be. So if we look at this now and we make a few changes to it, so a revised goal to this would be, given a second grade reading probe, Jesse will read 65 words correctly in 1 minute with 95% accuracy on 3 consecutive probes. All right, so now let's look at this. So now our condition is here. So it's given a second grade reading probe. So we know that that's where we expect Jesse to read 65 words per minute, when he's reading a second grade reading probe. And so we clarified the target a little bit. We said, read 65 words read correctly in 1 minute. And then our level of proficiency that we added is with 95% accuracy on 3 consecutive probes. Okay, so people usually have questions about, why do we say 65 words read correctly in 1 minute, and then we also say 95% accuracy? Because to a lot of people, those sound like the same thing. The reason we say that is because you could give a student a reading passage, and they could probably pick out 65 words in that reading passage that they can read individually, but they may not be reading the passage. So they could pick out words like the, a, but, he, so, you know, like simple words that they know, and they can maybe pick out 65 words and read them. But that doesn't mean they were actually reading the passage. So one of the things we want to do when we have a goal like this is we want the student to actually read the passage and try to make sense of it. So that's why we say reading 65 words correctly, but also reading with 95% accuracy on those probes. So they're not just picking out 65 random words in the passage and reading those correctly. All right, so let's look at a functional example. So functional goals, you know, are going to help increase the access, participation, or independence in the general education setting. All right, so let's look at this example. So it says, during each 40-minute class, Jose will pay attention and be engaged 95% of the time. All right, so let's look at our 3 elements and see what we have here. So do we have a condition? Well, yes, we have a condition because our condition is during each 40-minute class. So we know in class, in each 40-minute class that Jose has, we want him to do this. We want him to achieve this goal. So that's our condition. Our target behavior is kind of iffy, okay? Because we have on here, he will pay attention and be engaged. Well, what does that mean to pay attention and be engaged? So if that kind of behavior isn't specifically defined, and everybody understands what that means, then this goal is not really going to work, because one person's definition of paying attention and being engaged will be much different than somebody else's definition of paying attention and being engaged. So if you're going to use language like this, it has to be really, really defined, and everybody has to really understand what you're talking about when you say things like that. The last thing there is level of proficiency timeline. We put a question mark there again because we say 95% of the time. But this is one of those examples of, is that realistic? That may be ambitious. Is that realistic? Because if we think about it, we don't know what grade Jose is here. It doesn't tell us in this example, but say Jose is a first grader. Do you think just your typically developing first grader pays attention 95% of the time? Probably not, right? So why would we expect Jose to pay attention 95% of the time if that's not typical of his same aged peers? Okay, so when we think about revising this goal a little bit, we'll look at here's the example that we revised it for. So during each 40-minute class period, Jose will remain academically engaged at least 70% of the class for 5 consecutive days as monitored by daily DBRs. And so I'll explain what DBR is here in a minute, but let's take this one step by step first. The condition didn't really change during each 40-minute class period, so that stayed the same. The target behavior we changed to Jose will remain academically engaged, and then we also have at the bottom there as monitored by daily DBR. So what DBR stands for is direct behavior rating. So this is something you could look up. It's an actual thing, but it also it's a method for collecting data and it's a kind of a rating scale. It merges a rating scale with direct observation. So that's kind of what the idea is. It merges like a rating scale with what you directly observe from the student. But the most important thing is that direct behavior rating, it defines what academically engaged looks like. It says this is what it means for a student to be academically engaged, and it tells you the things to look for. So if it's okay to use a word or language like academically engaged, if you define what you mean by academically engaged, okay? And then the level of proficiency, it says 70% for 5 consecutive days as monitored by those DBRs. So that the way you can make sure that percentage is accurate or makes sense for students is you would have to do observations of the other students in the classroom. Like, what is a average typical student in Jose's class? How often are they academically engaged? Okay, so once you know that, then you can compare Jose to his typically developing peers and set an ambitious goal instead of just making up a random percentage like 95%. So 70%, that would only make sense again if you actually observe other students in the classroom. What is a typically student in the classroom? What are they typically? How often are they typically academically engaged? And then use that knowledge to set the goal for Jose, so you can set a goal that makes sense with his same age peers. So when you're making annual IEP goals, it's important to keep them fair. So this is an acronym that we use a lot when we're talking about goals, is making sure it's a fair goal. So what we mean by fair is, number one, is it feasible? So it is an appropriately ambitious goal, given the student's unique circumstances, and can the goal realistically be achieved in that 12-month period that we're talking about of the IEP? Number two, acceptable. So is the goal acceptable to the student, to the family, to the educators on the IEP team? So does it make sense to everybody that this is something the student would work for? Number three there, impactful. Will achieving the goal positively impact the student's access and benefit from the general education curriculum or other educational outcomes? So you don't want a goal over something that it's not really going to help the student. Like, why would you waste time and everybody's energy on something that's not going to help the student in their general education classroom, or to start making strides towards that general education curriculum. You want to make sure it's impactful for what the student actually needs. The last thing there is relevant. Does the goal connect to meaningful outcomes for the student and his or her family? So does it make sense for what the student needs again? And is it relevant for what the student needs either in school now or something they will need in that post-secondary life after school? Okay, so make sure your IEP goals are fair, feasible, acceptable, impactful, and relevant. Okay, so this is back to that slide that where we show everything, how everything connects together. So we talked a lot about IEP goals. And so remember, those goals help that student achieve towards that grade level progress, the grade level curriculum. And then all students are going to be assessed somehow on either a national or a state accountability measure. And all of those together kind of give you a temperature check on how is that student doing in school. Are they meeting the goals that they need to meet? Are they on track to keep making progress year after year to eventually be ready for that post-school success, either higher education, some other kind of post-secondary education or training, or being competitively employed or some other employment outside of after school. So all three of those things before with the IEP progress, grade level progress, performance on national and state accountability measures are all taking the temperature of that student in their school life to be ready for that post-school success. All right, so we're about to take our second break, but before we do, I just want to see, does anybody have any questions about goals or PLAFs or anything that we talked about with Riley?
Stephen, there was one question in the chat about whether or not you could talk a little bit more, talk again about the alignment piece to grade level standards. And one of the other things I just wanted to point out to people about, like, one of the lessons learned, because I know there's a lot of people who are in kind of the training role here as well, and some folks that are newer to this process, is really like for the goal piece, one of the things that we have found is the focus on how the meaningfulness of the goal in addition to the construction of the goal, and not over focusing just on the construction. Like, it's important for the goal to be measurable. We really want to make sure that we have measurable goals, but it's even more important that it's meaningful. And I think Stephen pointed that out, right, with the 95% like paying attention. And I mentioned in the chat, like a lot of the times I don't feel like I could hold myself accountable to 95% attention, right? But a lot of times we're setting these goals that either are unattainable or even maybe unmeaningful. Like, we just don't provide enough context about kind of what is the condition or the importance of this goal in order for the student to have that post-school success. So I think that's one of the pieces that we want to like ask ourselves as we look at some of these goals, and we ask people to think about the goals that they're setting, is like, what is the purpose of that goal in order to help the student achieve their ultimate goals and address the needs that they have, right? And to measure their growth in the statement of services and aids. So just thinking about kind of some of those bigger questions when we're thinking about goals, and not just like, did we set it, with a clear like target behavior and, condition? Because we can put all the components in and then we can look at it and say, gosh, that really does not tell us anything about the student's ultimate success and their movement forward. So just a couple of things to think about there.
Yeah, when we do this training, when we concentrate more specifically on goals than we are today, we have this activity where we have people look at examples of goals, more examples of goals, and so one of the ones that comes to mind is you want the student to have appropriate interactions on the playground, which may be important, it may not be important, but it depends on how is that going to help the students, in the long term? Is it going to help them? Is it because they have a big need from their PLAF statement about social interactions or maybe their inappropriate interactions with students? Then yes, it may be important. But if it's just because it's something that you think is important that the student do better at, then maybe it's not as important. So like what Amy says, it's like, is that something important? Is this goal that you're setting up important for that student to make progress either functionally or academically in the needs that are outlined in the PLAF? So that I see the question from Deanne there. Can you please clarify that alignment? Is that help, Deanne? I'm not sure of the alignment that you're you may have been asking about there.
Yeah, it did. Thank you.
Okay, good deal. Thank you. All right. Any other questions about goals or PLAF or anything like that before we take our next short break? All right, so let's go ahead and continue, finish up for the day. So the next part of the IEP that we're going to talk about is the statement of services and aids. So we've hit really three big parts today. We've hit our PLAF statement, we've hit our goals. Now we're going to hit the statement of services and aids. So if we go back to our stair step and how everything connects together, this would be that last part of that stair step. What is the knowledge, the skills, the strategies that students need to meet ambitious goals and show success in the general education classroom? So that's what our statement of services and aids talks to. Like what does the student need to learn and be accountable for in order to make to make progress on their goals and in the general education classroom. All right, so this is that other graphic that we've been showing over and over, kind of showing how everything's connected. Again, the needs in the PLAF statement, all the needs in the PLAF statement should be accounted for somehow in that statement of services and aids, either through accommodations, modifications, specially designed instruction, all the things that we're about to talk about here in that statement of services and aids. And then some of those needs are going to have goals. Those goals will also be tied to those services and aids and specially designed instruction, because they're going to tell you are the services and everything set up good well enough for that student to make progress on those goals. And if they're not, then again, we want to adjust those services and aids, especially design instruction and the things we're doing with the student, and help them to make progress on those goals. We don't really want to change the goals. We don't want to lower the goals, the expectations of the student. We want to keep those expectations high. We just may need to adjust what we're doing with the students. Okay, so there's 4 parts to the services and aids, and I'm just going to touch on them here. And then we have a video that we're going to show you that's going to kind of give a little more explanation. But there's 4 parts to the statement of services and aids. So even though there's 4 things here, all of these things come together to form one statement of the services and aids in the IEP. So the first one is the special education. So what we mean by that is, what is the specially designed instruction? So students need to have something that they're getting, or multiple things that they're getting specially designed instruction on. If they're only receiving accommodations, then they may not really qualify for special education. So to be in special education, you need to be having some sort of specially designed instruction for that student. Related services are those things that what else does the student need to help to benefit from that special education, from that specially designed instruction? So it could be transportation, it could be speech services, it could be occupational therapy. So what are those things that the student needs in order to benefit from that special education? The third one there, supplementary aids and services. Those are the things that like the accommodations or the assistive technology. What are those other things the student needs to help them benefit from the general education classroom? What are the things that we used in the general education classroom, but also maybe in the special education classroom for them to benefit from that general education, general curriculum instruction? The last thing there, program modifications or supports for school personnel. That means, what does the staff need, or what does the environment, how do we need to set up the environment for the student to be successful? Or is there training that the staff needs to help that student for us to do what we say we're going to do on the IEP? So all 4 of these together fit to make the statement of services and aids. Now, every student may not have something for all 4 of these, but you have to at least consider all 4 of these areas when you're writing up your statement of services and aids. All right, so next we're going to show a video that gives a little more explanation and I think a good visual representation, a good analogy of what the statement of services and aids are.
We'll begin your journey into the statement of services and aids with a quick analogy. Think of the IEP's statement of services and aids as a symphony orchestra, where every instrument represents a unique type of support or assistance given to a student with a disability. Just like a beautifully orchestrated musical performance, The services and aids listed in the student's IEP work together harmoniously to ensure students can fully engage in the general education curriculum and extracurricular activities to the maximum extent appropriate. Picture each aid or service as a distinct instrument in the orchestra. In an orchestra, every instrument plays a crucial yet unique role. Similarly, each part of the statement of services and aids plays a vital role in addressing the students' specific needs and paving the way for their progress in school. Understanding each component of the statement helps IEP teams develop and document specialized instruction, aids, and services that will make a real difference in the students' progress. Just like musicians in an orchestra, it's essential for the providers of these services to coordinate their efforts, share information, and align their strategies. This ensures a comprehensive and effective educational program that promotes student access to and benefit from the general curriculum. Just as musicians synchronize their playing, follow the conductor's cues, and support one another's contributions, the various aids and services outlined in the Statement of Services and Aids must work in perfect harmony to support the student's needs. By working together, these services create a powerful educational experience that supports the needs of the student. So let's celebrate the wonderful symphony of support that the Statement of Services and Aids brings to the IEP process. It's a true masterpiece that helps students with disabilities reach their unique potential in school and beyond.
All right. Oop, there we go. So just like that video says, the statement of services and aids, all four of these areas need to work together. Just like the parts of the IEP, all of these things need to work together as well for that student, for what that student needs. So if we look at this this definition straight from IDEA, so it says the statement of services and aids is the special education and related services and supplementary aids and services, and then down there at the program modifications and support that will help that student be successful in school. So when we do this activity, we do an activity sometimes when we work with districts and schools where we help them to realize, like, what is unique about how this is written, how this statement's written. And if you notice that the word "and" is between all these things, special education and related services and supplementary aids and services and the program modifications or supports. The reason is because you have to consider all of those things, just like I said before. Now, every student will have special education, some specially designed instruction, but every student may not have related services, or every student may not have, there may not be program modifications or supports that are needed. But you have to think about, does that student need it? And then how does it going to work together if that student does need those things? So the idea about the statement aids and services is that we want to make sure the things we set up, that they help the student advance appropriately towards those annual goals. They be involved in and make progress in the general education curriculum and participate in extracurricular and non-academic activities. And they're educated and participate with other children with and without disabilities as much as possible. So those are the three things that the statement of aids and services through IDEA says has to happen, have to be considered when you're writing that statement of aids and services and thinking about what that student needs. Okay, so I kind of mentioned this earlier, but just to reemphasize the point that if you read that first box there, it says the purpose of modifications or accommodations is to increase access to the general curriculum that the child, because of the disability, cannot access alone. Okay, so and if you read the second box, it says under IDEA, an accommodation or modification is not sufficient for progress. These should be paired with specially designed instruction to the extent appropriate to reduce the need for these supplementary aids and services. So in other words, what we're saying there is accommodation and modifications aren't designed to be with the student through their whole academic career. They're there until you teach them the skill that student can then take over on their own without maybe using the accommodation. Now, some accommodations may be necessary throughout their life, but the idea is that you're also teaching the students skills that they're going to learn, but they don't have to rely on every accommodation throughout their whole life. So that's the the thing about the accommodations paired with the specially designed instruction. So if a student only needs accommodations and modifications, especially just accommodations, then they may not need special education. They may need 504 services. So a student with a disability who only needs accommodations can get that through the Section 504 plan. But if they need specially designed instruction as well, that's when they need the IEP. So this is an example of how the statement of services and aids, even though it's these 4 parts that you think about, how they all fit together to make one statement. Okay, so in this example, we have a 6th grade student who has a learning disability that impacts the student's ability to decode and fluently read connected text. Okay, so the specially designed instruction / special education that they get is that daily 30-minute direct instruction in phonics and reading fluency taught by the special education teacher. So that's one part of the aids and services. Related services, they also get speech services to address the disfluency and stuttering that's impacting their fluent reading of connected text. And supplementary aids and services, they also get access to audiobooks or a peer reader to help them as needed. And then the program modifications or supports for school personnel is there's the special education teacher participates in the Orton Gillingham training program. So this is showing how all of these things, these 4 parts, all work together to help that student in their need of decoding and fluency reading connected text, and how all of those work together. All right, so that was kind of our section over the statement of services and aids. It's a lot quicker than we actually normally go over. we go over this a lot more in detail when we do this with schools and districts when we're talking about it specifically. But in this today, we just kind of wanted to touch on it. But any questions about the statement of services and aids before we move on? All right. Well, if something comes up, if you have a question that pops up, in the next few minutes, just put it in chat. We'll address it as well as we can. But in that case, I'm going to pass it over to Amy to kind of bring it all together for us.
Great, thank you, Stephen. And I just wanted to point out that one of the other Strand session, right, that's going on concurrently with ours was really focused in on that statement of services and aids section, really unpacking kind of all of those kind of components. And so it can be really challenging to like go through that quickly, but that might be a nice thing to refer to or listen to if you are interested in that section. The other thing that I dropped in the chat after the video was the overview or the link to our online training module that's really around the statement of services and aids. And that has some good interactive questions that can help you kind of unpack those different parts, go into those different parts of the statement in a little bit more depth. And again, only about a 30 or so minute module, but a nice way to kind of dig in a little bit further than we were able to do today with that statement piece. Because, as Stephen was mentioning, it can be one of the biggest challenges, right? One of the things that we often have a hard time understanding of, like, are we talking about specially designed instruction here, or are we just talking about good instruction? Are we talking about universal design for instruction that's good instruction for all students, or an evidence-based practice that's really helpful for all students? What is making it specially designed instruction is that connection to the need for the student, right? And so how do we really think about that as we're looking at our statement of services and aids? So I get the benefit of bringing it all together and helping us kind of reflect on a couple of the big picture items that we've talked about over the past 2.5 or so hours. So one of the first things, just want to reinforce kind of these 3 big buckets of FAPE that we want to think about as we're thinking about the design of our instructional programming and our IEP. Making sure that we're thinking about the procedural compliance to the timelines, to the components, and all of the procedures set out in IDEA to ensure that we're developing an IEP, for example, that meets all of those procedural requirements. That compliance piece is important because it's a legal right for those students, right? But we want to make sure that we're not just focused there on the procedural alone, and that we're really looking at the IEP to thinking about it as that bicycle, and we'll look at those analogies again in just a second, for that substantive piece, making sure that it's reasonably calculated, that those pieces fit together in a way that really has a good impact on the student. And recognizing, as Stephen talked about at the very beginning of this presentation with the equation, that no matter how great an IEP we design and develop, if we can't put it into practice, whether or not because we can't implement it with fidelity as we've designed it, or we don't have the capacity as our staff currently to be able to put it into practice, that's not going to give us the bang for our buck for the implementation of the IEP. And so really thinking about this IEP as this living document for ourselves to be able to design and support students and help them progress as they move forward in their educational programming. So if we think back to our bike example and the procedural parts of our bike, we're thinking about making sure that our IEP has all those 7 critical components and additional components as needed, our transition services, our age of majority, additional supports if a student is a language learner or has behavioral needs or other things as well that we might need to think about and consider within that document as well. But we need to make sure that we have these critical parts of our IEP, and then we need to make sure that we put them all together in a way that will allow us to move forward, that it's a bike that's usable and movable, and that has those individualized kind of pieces. We saw all those different bike examples early on in the presentation. It might look different for each kiddo, but we want to make sure that we're not leaving out those critical components, or, you know, we're not using a like penny farther wheel with like a, you know, a tricycle seat. You know, making sure that these pieces fit together in a way that will actually make progress. It doesn't matter if we have strong components on their own. We need to make sure that they actually work together to move this bike forward. And we talked about this kind of in this construct of this arrow diagram as well, and the interactive arrows as we think about just the internal consistency of the different parts of the IEP. And one of the activities that we didn't have a chance to go through ourselves today because we just didn't have enough time to be able to do this is this looking for connections resource. And so we have this kind of TA activity grew out of some of our work from working with our different partnership sites and our different trainings and so on to really help us think about making connections between those different parts of the IEP. There's a facilitator's guide and then there's a participant guide that goes along with this. And what it's really helping us to do is think about looking at our IEPs or even a sample IEP. What we have found sometimes it's really helpful to have a basic IEP as a starting place for this activity, or maybe just not an IEP that somebody is close to somebody's heart, the one that they have developed, because when you're really looking at the first time trying to find those connections, if they're not seeing those connections, maybe that's hard for people to kind of internalize. But this is allowing you to kind of look and highlight the identified needs in the present level statement. And then looking, okay, I've highlighted this specific need in green. I'm looking at the statement of services and aids. Can I find additional services and supports that are related to our need? And then I'm looking at my goals and can I see how those different goals connect to my needs? So just really trying to take a second to really think through kind of how those different pieces fit together. So this can be a helpful kind of interactive activity to allow people to really look at an IEP and to look at the internal consistency of that IEP so they can start to make those connections between those different parts so that we can really see whether or not we've got kind of our present level statement, the needs identified there, aligning to our services and supports, aligning to our goals and so on. And so we can go ahead and use kind of this highlighting activity to do it. And it has been really effective for a lot of the sites that have worked with us. And then after that, really having an interactive conversation about whether or not we can clearly identify those needs in the present level statement. Maybe we need to go back to that knowing our student activity that Riley took us through in the present level statement to help us really identify those needs for the student in just a conversation before we really get into kind of drafting our present level statement so that we can clearly articulate those needs in our present level statement. And then really thinking about, are there needs that don't have services or aids proposed to support them? Or vice versa, sometimes what we see, right, is that we have goals or services that if we look at our present level statement, they don't have a corresponding need, right? Sometimes we just have a list of lots of different accommodations or supports for students, but those aren't clearly connected to a need that we've identified in our present level statement. And so we need to ask ourselves then, is there a missing need in our present level statement? Have we not clearly identified the student's needs? Or are we providing them supports and services that might not be aligned to the needs that they actually have, right? So we want to make sure that we're looking both directions at these questions. Are we missing supports and services that the student needs in order to be successful? Or are we providing supports and services that aren't aligned with the needs that we have for the student? So this might be a helpful activity for you to kind of facilitate with folks. I know a lot of you are coaches or trainers or whatever your different roles. And so that might just be something helpful. And then for folks that are newer to this process, it might be helpful for you to look at your IEPs or look at a colleague's IEPs to really understand and make sure we're not making assumptions like Riley talked about in the assume-aside piece, right? Sometimes we make assumptions that the IEP says more than it does. And so when our colleagues look at it, they're like, we don't see what you're seeing in that document because it's not clear. All right. And back at the very beginning of the presentation, and Tessie's going to talk even more about this tomorrow during the general session, is these kind of critical components that are supportive of our system, right? We talked about within the fidelity kind of implementation that educators need to be supported and have the capacity in order to implement effectively, right? So if we're not providing those supports for leaders and educators in order to successfully implement the IEP and the supports and services for the students, it's much harder for us to be successful. If we're not ensuring the students feel engaged and part of a community and like they belong in the school environment, we can design a really great IEP and we can provide really great instruction, but the likelihood that they're going to benefit and be ready for that instruction is probably not quite there, right? We can think about our effective instruction and our supports for students. Are we really designing instructional programming around the IEP that will support the student, that will reinforce the instructional programming in the IEP? Are we helping students generalize the skills from their IEP in all of their other settings and so on? And then we think about kind of the importance of our collective efficacy, right? Our staff collaboration with general educators, with special educators, with related service providers, and most importantly, again, with parents and families and students themselves in order to develop and support these strong instructional programs. And Stephen mentioned this before, but right, we know there are going to be roadblocks along the way. We know that we were thrown for a loop when we had to go virtual and in COVID and have to come back from that. We know that we're thrown for a loop with, you know, a lot of missing positions or folks that are newer to the field who didn't get all the training and supports that they might have needed. And so we need to make sure that we're thinking about our systems and structures to emphasize some of these critical components so that we can ensure students are successful within the context we're living in currently. So just wanted to highlight a couple of places where you can find some of these key resources that we've talked about today in this session, and that might be helpful for you in your work. So we've spent a lot of time talking about the promotingprogress.org website. I live and breathe this every day. So if you ever have questions about finding resources, don't hesitate to reach out to the Progress Center email box. Ask for what you're looking for, and I can try and figure out whether or not we have something like that. But there's a lot of strong resources and materials we've developed over the year. One of the most important ones that we've talked a lot about over the course of this session has been these IEP tip sheets. I mentioned before, there's one for each of those components of the IEP, as well as that overview document that we looked at in detail. So all of those live on an overarching page called the overview of the IEP. And then also for the overview of the statement of services and aids, there are 4 subcomponent tip sheets that go into what are supplementary aids and services, what are related services, what is special education or SDI, what are program modifications and supports for school personnel. So that digs a little bit deeper into each of those components of that overarching statement. And as I mentioned earlier in the chat, hot off the presses are Spanish versions of each of these tip sheets as well. And so those are up on the website and linked on the same page as the tip sheet series overall, but have their own standalone page because those are available to you in Spanish. And then there are 2 tip sheets that are specific to parents and families, one around the overview as an or overview of the IEP as a whole, and then also one around the IEP team. So lots of different tip sheets and resources available to you. One of the other kind of pieces of tip sheets that we're working on and hopefully will come out not too long from now, but it will be a little while still. They're in the early development stages, are tip sheets related to each of the disability categories, because that came up in the work that we've been doing around supporting educators across the country. So we will have those for each of the disability categories eventually on the website as well. So if you didn't learn enough over these next couple of days and you are just really psyched and want to do more training and support, we have a collection of self-paced training modules that are available on the Progress Center website. And these cover lots of different topics. We have 3 kind of overarching course collections, one around the IEP that we have been talking about today. These really talk about some of the key critical components that we've talked about around the present level statement, around goals, around the statement of services and aids, and so on. And we'll add probably more to that collection over time around the other components of the IEP as well. We also, if you're kind of in a role where you need to think about special education law or kind of more of the overarching pieces of the special education piece and the legal foundations, and sometimes that's just really helpful to understand as you think about kind of IEP development and instructional programming. There's a collection of 3 different modules that are part of this Introduction to Special Education Law course collection that are available for you. And then there's a series around evidence-based instructional practices that are available around those high leverage practices that have been identified to support students with disabilities across grade levels and different disability categories. So looking at planning for instruction and delivering instruction and intensifying instruction and cognitive and metacognitive strategies, lots of different resources and materials there as well. And all of these live in a learning management system. And so as part of that learning management system, if you take a course in the online system, you get a course completion certificate in order to provide that for PD credits and so on. And so you can access all of those there as well. And it's co-housed with the National Center on Intensive Intervention, which also has a lot of different tools and resources and training modules around progress monitoring, around intensifying instruction, around explicit instruction that really go in depth that might be helpful for you all as well. And we highlighted these different kind of TA resources throughout the presentation, the Getting to Know Your IEP, and I just talked about the Looking for Connections one. The Analyzing Progress Center IEP tip sheets activity is kind of the activity we did at the front end with the overview of the statement of services and aids, but this is a facilitator guide that goes along with that. We have found that really focusing in and not just handing someone a tip sheet, but allowing them to really kind of engage with and understand that content and have conversations around it, especially if it's a cross group of general educators and special educators and related service providers and maybe family members as well, to have some of those conversations and unpack kind of like misconceptions around some of that language as well can be really helpful. So that's another resource that's available to help you facilitate those conversations. And then, because you always need more resources, right? This is a collection of resources related to engaging with parents. So I mentioned the 2 tip sheets earlier, but there are some resource around IEP team meetings, guidance for families and supporting families in the IEP team meeting, prior to the meeting, during the meeting, and after the meeting. And then Riley mentioned earlier about these 2 handouts about gathering information from parents and families or from students prior to that team meeting. And so these might be some tools, or you can customize them based on your needs, that might be helpful for you to think about how are we generating or gathering that information from students, from their families prior to the meeting about their goals for the future, what they want to accomplish in the next year, what has worked for them in the past with supports and services or accommodations, what hasn't worked, and so on. And so just really making sure that we're taking the time to collect some of that information ahead of time so we can use that in order to develop a strong program for students. And with that, We're going to just end with doing a little bit of a self-reflection and a group reflection. So we're going to let you guys take a little bit of time to do this 3, 2, 1 reflection. We don't have a handout for you to do it, so you can just write down on a piece of paper if you have one next to you, or just think about them. 3 things you learned today that you want to remember, 2 things that you'll try and implement after the session, and 1 thing that you want to learn more about. So just go ahead, if you have a little piece of paper with you now, you can mark those down. If you have a Word document on your computer, feel free to pull that up. But just take note of a couple things that you learned today that you want to make sure you remember, or things that you want to implement, and so on. And then we're going to give you guys a little bit of time to have a conversation in a small group about kind of some of those reflections that you've had as well. So I think Mia will go ahead and throw us out into small groups. So just take a second to reflect on your own, and then we'll throw you into those small groups to reflect as a group. If you are transitioning back in and you want to type an intention, either something you learned today or something that you want to implement, sometimes I think that I'm more intentional about actually putting into practice if I put it down in writing. So hopefully you had a chance to have some conversations with others about that, and that will help you as well. But if you want to jot something in the chat, feel free to do that, to share with other folks about kind of things that you took away from today, things you want to remember, or an intention that you have about implementing something that you might have learned today. See, we have a couple people still left in a breakout, so we'll let them all join us back in a couple seconds. All right. So I think we've got everyone back over here, but love that. Specific, measurable annual goals, really thinking about being intentional about the goals. Yeah. So other things, if people want to jot down or share in the chat, feel free to share your intentions about any kind of actions you think you might take, or areas you might focus on based on the conversations today, or things you might explore further. But we're just going to close out with a couple last things before we let you go for the next part. Oh, and this is my interactive slide, so hopefully this will all work, especially with Stephen running the show on moving the slides over. But as I want us to all think about, as we're thinking about this idea of promoting progress for students with disabilities, we're really thinking, and we've talked today a lot about the IEP being at the heart of some of that support for students with disabilities, but not being the support alone. And those students with disabilities are experiencing our instructional programming. Stephen, if you want to click in the general education setting, right, in the core curriculum, in our general curriculum, thinking about the small group instruction, the whole class instruction, and individualized instructions and supports, and then really thinking about all of these kind of pieces really being grounded in this idea about student belonging and connection, and the friendships they make and the connections they make that allow them to really access and benefit from their instructional programming, right? So you feel, I know I feel, always more intentional about learning and being able to be engaged in work if I have close relationships and peers and feel connected to a community. And so the same thing for our students, and thinking intentionally about how we're creating those structures and supports so they have those intersections in the, lunchroom or on the playground, or all of these different things, having friends and connections, working together in classrooms and having those opportunities as well. So thinking through that as we think about this work. And to end our session today, we just wanted to highlight another kind of video, one of our stories from the classroom videos that really helps us to think about why we do what we do. This one features Zuann, and she's going to talk about kind of that experience of belonging.
Stories from the classroom, finding belonging. Meet Sue-Ann, a young adult recalling her school experiences.
Grade school was tough. My peers would be playing basketball or running track or whatever, and I would just sit on the sidelines. I just mainly watched. Some Some of my gym teachers would, when we played basketball, they would give me like a ball and let me throw it into a little bucket or something. But it's still like, I still felt like I was the odd one. I didn't feel included, and I didn't feel like, I just felt left out. I was a pretty independent kid, and I was also a pretty prideful kid. And I didn't want to ask for help unless I was drowning. And then when I was drowning, it was too late.
While attending a youth conference with members of her church, Sue-Ann heard a speaker discussing depression among students across America. She thought, he's talking about me. It was so powerful to her that she knew right then and there that she wanted to step out of her depression.
From then on, I really fought to change my identity. I'm not this like disabled person. I am loved, and I am fearfully and wonderfully made, and I tell myself this, and it's just done so much for my confidence.
Soon after, her youth pastor tried to include her in an activity. She was so used to staying on the outside and not being included that she whispered to her cousin and asked her cousin to tell him that she couldn't do it. To which he said, "Why can't she?"
I just remember that phrase, "Why can't she?" And that really stuck with me, like, why can't I do this? Why can't I do whatever everyone else does? And so I think it's just having those people. It doesn't need to be a lot of people, but just those key figures in my life that really speak words of life and words of wisdom. And because as a person with disabilities, I get the word no all the time. And it's just so refreshing when someone says, you can do this. You just have to figure out another way.
Sue-Ann is now finishing her master's in social work while serving on the university's Disability Advisory Board and running a student organization called Indivisible that centers around disabilities.
That gift that each one of us has, it's not just for us. It's for other people too.
So Sue-Ann, video is old. She's actually graduated, is now a counselor and doing great work. And she was actually featured on a panel that we had last year at the Prepping for Progress. So again, if you're interested in learning more, you can go ahead and view that panel presentation as well. But I think some of the things that really stick out and stand with me in that video is just the impact of somebody saying you can do this, or why can't you do this, and how can we ensure that you can and feel connected to this experience, and really thinking outside the box. And I think that's the gift that we all bring to this work. And I think you all do it every day in the work that you do. And so just being intentional and thoughtful and ensuring students feel that and have that voice. I loved how many people shared that in the intentions or the non-negotiables earlier today as well. So with that, I think we are mostly done with this session. We just have a couple reminder slides after this for the next part. Stay connected with us on Facebook and Twitter. Join our newsletter if you like. The next part of the agenda is the resource spotlights. If you want to learn more about any of the activities that we talked about, or learn from others who have used those activities, either the modules, the resources for parents, the tip sheets, things like that, feel free to join the Expo Center. You just go ahead and enter the booth starting at 4 o'clock. It will be open, and you can click on those. You can attend multiple booths and just jump around as you see fit. So you'll just enter a booth and leave a booth and so on as you want to navigate around those resources. It will also be open for folks, mostly probably more so the early folks on the East Coast, because it will be very early, I realize, for folks on the West Coast at 7:15 tomorrow morning. But if you want to have your first coffee with us, we welcome that as well. But it will just be a repeat of that session again tomorrow. So feel free to choose one of these two if you want to explore. If you want to explore different sessions tomorrow, you can do that as well, or different booths. And yeah, you'll just navigate in, you'll click enter booth, you'll see a kind of a screenshot that looks like this that will say, you know, the Progress Center resources. You'll click join if you want to join and have a conversation. You can also just watch the conversation, be a kind of a voyeur in that conversation from the outside, so you don't even have to join, but we hope you'll join and talk to us. And then you can leave the booth at any point just to explore something else. So we hope that you'll join us there. Yeah, you can flip through these ones, I think, Stephen. And just a reminder again about the session schedule tomorrow. We'll have that resource spotlight early on in the morning, but our main sessions will start at 11 Eastern time, just like today, a general session again, like we had today. And then tomorrow afternoon, we'll have that, or later in the day, we'll have that opportunity for the concurrent sessions. And you can choose 2 of those different sessions to attend. So thank you all for your time. I know this is a long time for a virtual session, but we appreciate your engagement throughout this time. You guys are rock stars. We appreciate all the work that you do every day, and don't hesitate to reach out to us at any point. If you have questions, you'll be able to see the recording. I think it goes up probably, you know, within a half hour or so after the session. So if you want to look back at anything that we talked about, you're welcome to do that as well. But yeah, stay connected to us. We look forward to connecting with you across the rest of the sessions today and tomorrow.